Okay, welcome to the second session of the Culture of Schooling Project Talk series. Cristina Moya, our speaker today, is an assistant professor at the Anthropology department at UC Davis, a honorary lecturer in psychology for the Center for Culture and Evolution at Brunel University, and she's also a board member of the Culture of Schooling Project. Cristina's work explores, among several other topics, the cognitive adaptations that underlie the instantiation of social group identities. In order to do that, she combines modeling as well as experimental methods from a comparative and developmental perspective. Today, Cristina will present a meta-analysis of studies that use the switch at birth paradigm, which is a classical method employed in works that aim to disentangle the relationship between social categories and psychological essentialism. So please welcome Cristina. You can unmute if you want to give her a welcome.
I think I was
the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. You should write my blurb on my website. It's better than I have. So I admitted earlier that I was hoping to, I started this meta-analysis a long time ago, and I was hoping to use this deadline as an excuse to update it with some more recent results. That failed to happen. So for some of you, this will be somewhat the older results that you might have seen before. But it's a constantly expanding field that has been using this paradigm that, you know, Susan, I'm like a little bit ashamed here, has or daunted here, has like developed a while ago, and it's been very prolific for figuring out how people think about biological kinds and also social kinds. So I tried to meta-analyze these results with the hope of trying to understand something about how people think about different kinds of social categories. We often think that humans are groupish by nature or think in social kinds, but if you look at the ethnographic record, there's just such a diversity of ways that social groups, we might call them ethnic groups, oftentimes are constituted. And we have groups that all the way here on the left-hand side really put a lot of effort into and put a lot of cost into actually assimilating new members into the group, which seems like an anti-essentialist approach. I'll talk about the Marand in a bit as well, who also, through a different means of not proselytizing, incorporated other members into their groups, all the way to this case study that from Myanmar, but they're not Burmese people, but Chin people who, according to early 20th century ethnographers, reported having this tradition of, or this practice of tattooing women's faces to prevent Burmese men from carrying off the women and raping them. So a kind of cultural technology, not to prevent people from entering their group, but from preventing people from leaving the group in a sense. Right, so trying to fix an ethnic boundary. So when you're faced with this ethnographic record and then some psychological evidence that perhaps humans have essentialist intuitions, it's hard to reconcile them, or maybe we'll try to reconcile them. How do we get, with the same human psychology, this diversity of cultural institutions? So I started before with this case study of John von Neumann, who is one of the founders of game theory. He designs and devises self-replication machines. He's a famous mathematician. You might not know about him, and it's probably not that important to know about him, but that he was born to a non-observant Jewish family in Budapest. But then halfway through his life, around 27 years of age, he converts to Catholicism, and he stays a Catholic for the rest of his life. And you might ask yourself, do you think that his identity is Jewish? Do you think his identity is Catholic? Is it both? Is it both in different ways? And people might disagree about this, right? So a rabbi might say, and it probably depends even on the tradition of Judaism, might say that he's still Jewish. Some neo-Nazis would probably also say that he's still Jewish, but the Catholic priests and community would be very happy to have him convert to Catholicism, generally, right? And so barring the neo-Nazis, like reasonable people might disagree about even a given ethnic boundary, or in this case, an ethno-religious boundary, in terms of whether it's one that people can switch. And I would argue that the belief in this case that the rabbi held, right, the belief that identities are inherited and stable so inherited somehow vertically and stable at birth, are somewhat puzzling from an evolutionary perspective. And this is coming from my hyperadaptationist hierarch self that doesn't believe in phylogenetic lags, doesn't believe in mismatches or lags or misfirings. Because if we're being hyperadaptationist about this, we would recognize that for all kinds of ethno-cultural religious groups that humans belong to, socialization matters. We acquire the ability to perform our identities, right? We acquire the ability to be competent members of our society. It's not somehow genetically given at birth. If we look at our nearest relatives of gray apes and other primates, and we think of the types of groups that they form, they almost always, and there's a primatologist in the audience, Anita will correct me if I'm wrong, at least one sex disperses at birth. Sometimes both sexes disperse from the natal group. So if this is the kind of pre-adaptation that we're thinking of as like a cognitive mechanism for thinking about groups in humans, those groups are not fixed boundaries. In fact, there's constant migration at puberty, I might have said at birth, sorry, at puberty or adolescence to another group. And then when we think of the diversity of cultural groups that we belong to, that we've culturally evolved, we often are structured into these nested categories of identities. We have these higher order group structures. So we can be Catalan, we can, even while being Catalan, we could also be Spanish, and we can be European or not, right? Some people might disagree about that. So this suggests that, again, like, and we know from the psychological evidence that you can kind of switch back and forth between which identities are salient to you depending on kind of social needs. And we know from the ethnographic literature that groups like the Nuer would also come together when they had like, they needed to raid, or they had warring contexts that required multiple lineages to come together for functional purposes. So that again suggests that there is a lot of context in which fluid social identities really matter. And as I alluded to at the beginning, some identity changes are welcome, not just Mormons. A lot of proselytizing religions want to get new people. I'm sure, you know, I don't know if any of you have canvassed before, but like a lot of people also expend a lot of effort to try to convince others to vote in their camp. You know, even if you hate somebody from a different political party right now, you'd be very happy to convince them to change to your political party. And this is not just a modern American phenomena. Famously, the Shakers, a 19th century, well, I guess they're still pretty modern American context, but the Shakers are a religious group that mandated celibacy from their group, but they're always held up as like a stupid cultural tradition that went extinct because they were celibate. But in fact, they maintained their numbers and grew for a while because they adopted other members of the community, right, and assimilated them into Shaker culture. And the Marans that I had a picture of early on, also from Papua New Guinea, were described by early 20th century, mid 20th century anthropologists as kind of having to actually raid neighboring groups to replenish their numbers because they had high rates of secondary sterility. On the other hand, other identity changes are discouraged, and I think this is what we're more used to thinking about in the modern context, that there are a lot of anti-assimilationist policies. This is from early 20th century US, or anti-immigration policies that we might be concerned about. And in fact, while we, if there might be a lot of Americans, like writ large, Americans from all of the Americas today here, in fact, we are overrepresented as kind of the new world, the Western Hemisphere. I know these are all arbitrary, but the Western Hemisphere is overrepresented in terms of granting automatic birthright citizens for children of immigrants. So it's not, we might naturalize that birthplace is the way to give citizenship to people, but that's not a universal feature of nation states. So what can account for these beliefs, and how can we explain cross-cultural variation in these beliefs? So there are some arguments that it's just generally a tendency for humans to essentialize, to believe that identities are, I mean, it's a conglomeration of things. So deeply held essences that then predict a lot of different other behaviors, but oftentimes also inherited at birth. And there's one claim that argues that these are somehow being transported from the way that we think about species biological species. And if that's the case, we might predict that something like morphological differences between groups are going to increase the extent to which we essentialize the group. I myself have argued, you'll see probably incorrectly, but that perhaps we think of language boundaries as the types of groups that are really important for human evolutionary history that map onto a lot of different cultural differences, and therefore ones that might be worth essentializing. So we might think of language boundaries as ones that are relatively fixed at birth. Some other things that clearly humans use quite regularly cross-culturally to mark cultural boundaries include intentional markers. So that might be something else that amps up this kind of fixed at birth or essentialist intuition. So to be fair, for the remainder of the talk, every time I say essentialism, it's really only one small component of essentialism, this kind of intergenerational inheritance at birth. Status differences between groups might also be, and there's some evidence that they do in fact increase essentialist intuitions or unwillingness to allow people to cross that boundary. And then kind of motivated by all of these proselytizing religions, I think we might predict that if we're in the realm of proselytizing religions anyway, religious differences between groups might decrease the extent to which are essentialist about groups' boundaries. So the switched at birth task probably doesn't need an introduction here, but it's a really simple task that seems to get patterns out of people, even though it's a bit of a weird scenario. It relies on telling people, including children. So it's nice that you can use it with children and with adults, and it's been used cross-culturally in quite a lot of different contexts. So it relies on telling people a story about a kid that was born to one set of parents who tragically die in some various ways. People are cruel and unusual in their vignettes in terms of how they make the parents die in a locally appropriate way. And then the child is orphaned at birth and is raised by adoptive parents from another group in ignorance, almost always, like the pure cases in ignorance of their birth parents' identity. Okay. And there are various tweaks to this, but I've tried to limit the selection to cases where the death happens really early on in infancy and where it's in ignorance of the previous birth parents' identity. And then we ask participants, when this child grows up, will he be, in this case, this is one of the boundaries that I've studied more, will he be Quechua, like his birth parents, or Aymara, like his adoptive parents? So this is just an ethno-linguistic boundary in the Peruvian Altiplano where I've worked. So I collated these studies a while back, so there have been some more since then, including when I was talking to Alejandro, that's not here, that he collected among the Wichi. And first I'm going to show you just the data for adults. So this, I cut it off at 20 years of age. Okay, so everybody above 20 years of age is an adult in this figure. And each dot represents a different effect. It doesn't necessarily reflect a different study, right? So you might have multiple studies within, multiple effects within one study, and multiple boundaries, social boundaries within one place. So for example, this is a case collected by Rita Estudi among the Vezo in Madagascar, when the Vezo themselves were asked about a Vezo to Masikoro adoption, and the same population was asked about a Vezo to Karani adoption, and vice versa. And the first thing that's striking is just the massive variation that exists, right? It goes all the way from highly essentialist beliefs, around 80% of adults saying that that kid is going to have the same identity as the birth parents, to 0% of adults saying that that kid is going to have the same identity as the birth parents. If you average these out, it's something around 30%, which is actually around the same percent that Alejandro, I think you find in your study with the Wichi. Now, luckily, this is a simple enough task that it can be done cross-culturally with kids. And not all of these have kids' data, but I've tried to connect the kind of societies with lines that are from the same place and the same boundary, right? So there's still quite a lot of variation among children, although less so, right? And if you kind of follow the lines with your eyes, you can see that there are some places where the intuitions become more essentialist in adulthood, but a lot of places where they become less essentialist in adulthood. Those would be the ones that are dropping. Okay, so that's a descriptive graph. There's no statistics here except for descriptive stats, no inferences. So now we want to ask which, those are a bunch of different social boundaries. Some of them are linguistic boundaries, some of them are religious boundaries, some of them are both. So now we want to ask which kinds of boundaries are associated with more stability beliefs. And what we find is that all of those cues, so intentional stylistic differences, status differences between groups, religious differences between groups, language differences, by the way, with language differences, I had to kind of code them up to language versus dialectical or no language difference. So dialectical differences are kind of collapsed with no linguistic difference. And morphological differences, if those are a difference that characterizes the boundary, it increases the extent to which people choose the birth parent identity, the extent to which they believe it's stable. Susan asks, these are just versions looking at types of humans, not with animals. Yes, Susan, so I'll get back to the animals at the end, actually. I've put those separately. So morphological differences in the human case, humankinds are almost always skin tone differences. I'm trying to think if there were anywhere it was exclusively another trait, and I don't think so. But it wasn't always black-white. So for example, in the Madagascar case, the Vezo-Karani difference is the Karani are of South Asian descent, Indian descent, I believe, and the Vezo are Malagasy descent. So not always the black-white difference that American social psychologists really focus on. But that's, yeah, we can talk about that case study later. So here, anything over anything positive over 0 is an increase in the essentialism, basically. And all of these were run independently of each other because we just don't really have the great statistical power to put that in the same model. They're somewhat overlapping, but you can see that some of them show larger effect sizes. Basically, the style, status, and religion are up here. Morphology, there's much less precise estimate. There are large confidence intervals as it is, but it's lower. So because we have the developmental data, we can also ask whether these develop differently through the life course. So if certain kinds of groups maybe trigger essentialist reasoning, so if people have certain biases that are early developing, to think of some groups as fixed at birth, and then learn that that's not the case as they become older, right? So it could be that any kind of evolved predisposition might be more visible early on in life before socialization. It's a kind of common assumption that some developmental psychologists use. And when we do that, so now I'm showing you the interaction effect of the cue with age. So in this case, anything that's above 0 is a cue that increases in the extent to which it is motivating essentialist intuitions as people age. Okay, so what this is showing is that as people age, they use style and status differences between groups as stronger indicators that they should be essentialist about them, or they essentialize them more as they age. I actually think this is going to be more clear in a plot that I'll show you in a second, in another graph. But if I also ran a model comparison where all of the models that I've showed you so far, because I did each effect separately, I compared them all, look at the WIC weights to see which ones fit the data best. And the models that are style interacting with age, or status differences between groups interacting with age, are the ones that receive like the vast majority of the weight. So what does this look like in terms of how there's an interaction effect, but that can mean lots of different things. But what do these look like? So Yarrow asked, can you remind me what style is? So style is usually an intentional stylistic marker. It was usually clothing differences. I think they're even, you might be part of this, like weren't there some that were even, or one of your colleagues, if not, that had arbitrary t-shirt colors used for this task? I think there might have been even an arbitrary t-shirt color, but most of them were like, there tends to be a garb difference between people in these two groups. Okay, so it's hard to really show binary data in a descriptively, but this is jittered data, so a lot more down here. It's a very dark, the adults are very much on the 0 side of things. What I'm going to show you is how these change as the probability of making a birth parent assessment of identity changes with age for groups that have a style difference between them in purple versus the ones that don't have a style difference between them in beige. So you can see that generally the essentialist rates, or the rates of ascribing an identity that's like the birth parent, decreases with age, but it decreases more strongly for the no style difference, the groups without a style difference, than for the ones with a style difference. Okay, so you actually see children are not really being particularly differentiating about these, but adults are expected to be. By adulthood, they are. It's pretty much the same pattern for status differences. You see that children don't really, that you can't really see the status difference effect in children. There might be some case studies where it shows up better, but on the whole, it doesn't show up cross-culturally. But by adulthood, you can detect that people are more essentializing about groups where there's a status difference between them than ones where there isn't a status difference between them. And then all the other kinds of group differences that we looked at basically show no interaction effect with age. Yes, they increase the extent to which people are essentialists. So this is with language, but it's pretty much constant with age. Same thing for religious boundaries and same thing for morphological boundaries. So going back to our predictions, we see, yeah, maybe some, morphological differences do increase the extent to which people are essentializing the group, but that's also true for language differences. That's also true for intentional markers and status differences. And in addition, for those two, that difference increases with age, right? So we don't see any evidence that there's like an early developing bias that children think that something matters more than the adults do overall. And then in the religious difference case, we actually get the opposite result, right? It's not the case that religious differences are less likely to engender essentialist beliefs. Groups with religious differences, people are still essentializing them, are still thinking of those identities as fixed at birth. That could be partly driven by the fact that a lot of those were Jewish Muslim boundaries in the Middle East, right, which are also ethnicized, and where you might argue, well, Judaism's not particularly proselytizing, so that's not really the best place to test that hypothesis. Okay, so one more thing on the morphological differences in this argument that Francisco Hill-White and others have perhaps also agreed is a plausible one, that people think about ethnic groups as if they were different species. This is my only mildly offensive version of that hypothesis. And so, to be charitable to the hypothesis, it's something like, well, clearly humans have folk biological intuitions about species. They tend to think about species as fixed at birth, but then there are certain features about the way that cultural ethnic groups are constructed, namely that people inherit it from their parents, that they share a lot of different traits with members of the cultural group, that kind of makes use of then the same kind of psychology that evolved for thinking about species, but now is applied to ethnic cultural groups, even if they're not different species. And so, lucky for us, Susan already alerted us to it. People have used the same exact method for cross-species comparisons, right? So in this case, the paradigm is just something like, what if a chicken adopted a duck? Although actually, I think that's not quite right, because I don't think the labels are used, right? There's a little creature, it's a baby, it was born to a chicken or a duck, but then it was raised by chickens, right? And when we look at this, first of all, there are fewer studies that I know of. So if you know of any other studies that I'm missing, I might have gotten them, but I might not. So please do let me know. But here again, in adulthood, we have fewer studies, but there's also way less variation, right? By adulthood, people are super essentialist about this. There's a bit of variation, and like, people have written about this variation as reflecting real differences in worldviews about species kinds. So as low as 80%-ish, right, which is pretty high for the human social kinds, but low for species reasoning. And if we look at how that develops, it consistently increases with age. There are a couple places where it's high already from the get-go, right, from 5 years of age. Now, putting that all, the species and the ethnic differences or the cultural group differences, all onto the same axis, we see a really different developmental trajectory, right? We see actually a predicted difference already in the children, where they're already more essentialist about species than about social groups early in adulthood. And then that skyrocket, that narrows down in terms of the range, and skyrockets up to 100%, more or less 90% of people essentializing the species boundary. Whereas for the social kinds, it tends to go down, but it also widens out to greater diversity. So I think that should make us at least somewhat skeptical or pause in thinking about exactly how much or how easily that species psychology, if it exists and is applied to humankind, like how easily does it actually get applied to human social groups? So the belief that ethnic group identities are stable are, I think, unlikely to be accounted for by species reasoning, or at least not in a very easy way. It seems that they culturally co-evolve, at least in part, they culturally co-evolve with intentional markers and status differences between groups. So this would be a pathway whereby the cultural groups where the group boundary is marked by status differences or by intentional markers also are the types of groups that develop ideas about the fixedness of that boundary, right? And that tells us less about kind of human evolved intuitions than it does about the cultural evolutionary trajectory. And so I'm just happy that it's pretty short, brief. I want to thank collaborators. I started this a long time ago with Joe Henrik and Richard McElrath and various RAs that helped us comb through the literature. And so I'm happy to have the conversation go wherever is interesting to you and to get any feedback on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this is the time to ask questions. Okay, we have Susan.
I'm happy to ask the first question, although Yarrow did have his hand up first.
Oh yeah, you're right. Now I'm seeing the list here. Okay.
Either way is fine, but well, thanks, Susan. That was very gracious of you. I really loved this talk. Thank you so much for this. It was really awesome stuff, really exciting. Oh, I got to change my view because I'm not seeing everyone. Okay, there we go. I guess my question is how much we can tell. So as you pointed out at the beginning, there's such a huge variety of social groups within each culture, right? So I guess I'm curious, like, are we seeing genuine like cultural differences here, or are we just seeing a very non-random sample of what groups were selected in each culture, right? Like, could there be the full range of essentialist intuitions about groups within each culture? And it's because we have such limited data, we see what looks like huge cultural variation, but is actually just variation in the particular groups that are selected.
Yeah, totally. So I actually could test that a little bit. It wouldn't be perfect, but I do have a random effect for cultural group, and then because some of them have multiple boundaries that they're asked about per cultural group, so I could look at the amount of the variance that's explained by that random effect. It still wouldn't be perfect because obviously, like, you go to the Middle East to study Palestinian, or the obvious boundary for people to study in the Middle East is like the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or Jewish Muslim. So it wouldn't be the types of groups that people ask about is not like a random assortment of boundaries in the world. So there, I guess when I write up this paper, and this has been like one of the things tripping me up, but I probably should lean into some of the very nice, clear case studies that people have presented, right? So I think what an American intuition is often that like something like skin tone, people like if you give anybody a skin tone difference, they're going to know that they're going to essentialize that. And we do have switched at birth data for not just identity, but like other features, right? Features that are not tapping into this identity. And I've collected that data in Peru, my collaborators, so in Fiji as well. And we do see that people like reliably by middle childhood, they already know, kind of have this intuition that more morphological traits are more likely to be inherited from the parents, the birth parents, and more belief traits on the other end are more likely to be inherited from the adoptive parents. So do you know, I don't want to be patronizing. I'm sure a lot of you know that Rita Studi's work on this in the Bezo, right? What I like using this for undergraduates also because the American intuition is so strong that like clearly skin tone is going to be the thing that marks a group boundary, right? And what she finds for those who are not familiar with it is that among the Bezo, yes, they recognize that there's a skin tone and like other kind of morphological features that differentiate the Karani from the Bezo, the Karani being of South Asian descent, but that's not what makes you Bezo, right? So they've defined the group boundary in a performative way. Like what makes you Bezo is being a fisher, maybe a bit of horticulture as well, like, but fishing, right? The practice of fishing. And so in the US, it's very clear that like what makes you Black is having like one drop of Black ancestry and not passing, right? And obviously like we're having more meaningful conversations around that, but like we still live with that history, right? And so I think that it's possible both to have that, like have a human intuition that reliably develops about certain features being more likely to be inherited vertically and constitute your social groups in ways that don't necessarily map onto those, right? But yeah, the unrepresentativeness of the data set, yeah, I definitely don't want to argue that it's cultural differences independent of the boundary. Like each observation is at the boundary level.
I love the idea of like wherever you have multiple observations of very similar groups or groups that we can somehow classify meaningfully together, where there are big cases of cultural variation there, it's kind of more persuasive, I guess, or more interesting in terms of arguments for cultural difference.
Yeah. Thanks. Was I right that you did were you involved in the t-shirt one? Who was it, the t-shirt one?
Did something like that once, but my recollection is that didn't get published, but so maybe the t-shirt one. But anyway, yeah, who knows?
Well, if you guys know of unpublished, like I have some unpublished results there also that I just happen to know from friends having done it. If anybody wants to add that, I'm happy to put the gray literature into this.
Okay, Susan.
Thanks. Yeah, this is such a great talk. And I really like how you framed and interpreted the data, very rich. I had a lot of thoughts. I'm going to try to like quickly ask you three questions that I was thinking about as you were presenting. So the first, I find it really interesting that these intentional markers are the ones that are signaling that a group is essentialized, because they seem like these are like a matter of choice. It's an intentional action, what clothes you put on. In fact, in the developmental literature, like the t-shirt sort of manipulations, like the minimal group. So it's very, in some ways, very surprising to me that those are like the strongest. And I wondered how you were thinking about that, or how you were explaining that.
Yeah, I should go back and look at which exactly those case studies are. But I think that what's happening is it's not like the causal claims are really weak here, right? And so it would have to be something like the types of group boundaries where people have bothered to mark them in these ways for other reasons, people are also essentializing them, right? As opposed to that, donning the hat makes it a thing. Now, of course, it could be donning the hat. It could also be the tattooing, And one of my favorite cases that I have like side project interest on is cranial modification, because as Andianists know, like it's a archaeologically common, like elongation or flattening, depending on where, and it's cross-culturally really common archaeologically. I don't know, why did this disappear? I have some ideas, but it's kind of interesting. Actually, we do still kind of cranially modify. Have you seen the babies with like the helmets that make their heads really round? I guess that's just modern day cranial modification. So it could be intentional and still, you know, actually fixed from then on. But we see those less and less. And I think none of the ones in these case studies are like that. I think all the ones in these case studies are, to be fair, like sartorial. And so it's just, yeah, I think it's picking up on something else, that it's like a meaningful enough group that, and a meaningful enough boundary that.
Got it. And I guess in a way that sort of fits with how, I mean, you didn't talk about gender, of course, but gender is
I explicitly
so strongly essentialized, and there's so many sort of intentional markers that get put on to differentiate, you know, boys and girls from, you know, from birth. So I guess that's sort of a comparable thing.
Well, that's a good, yeah, that's a good way of explaining it, in terms of like, it's not the intentional markers per se, but it is an important enough boundary that you like exaggerate the difference there.
Yeah, that's good. That's helpful. The second thing that I was going to ask you is, you know, given that variation, I was wondering how much variation you see within a sample, like within a particular study, for example, and whether that variation is just seems sort of random, or does it seem systematic in some way? And like, this reminded me of, I mean, it's just this one paper, but my colleague Ram Mahalingam reports a study of adults doing with a switch at birth task about caste in India. And he found that where people were in the hierarchy determined whether they're more or less essentialists in ways that were, you know, that made sense. If you were Dalit, then you saw the role of social construction in the system. But if, you know, if you're advantaged by these caste differences, and you tended to see them as more like fixed. So yeah. I don't know, like if there's enough information in the data to kind of look at that sort of variation.
I think that's the way it should be written, like picking up some of these case studies. That one is in the meta-analysis, because it's such a, yeah, it's a classic. I actually picked up on it. Unfortunately, like all my greens look the same. I think it might be, no, I don't think it's these two, because I don't think he had children.
He might have had like adolescents.
Okay.
And I think they maybe were just like a chance, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so within boundary, the variance is just going to be maximized at 50%. But I think, like you're saying, what you're alluding to is like picking up on some of the structural differences of the studies and highlighting those. Now, kind of motivated by that, and also some further that observation that status differences in that context work the way you'd expect them, where, you know, the Brahmins are kind of policing that boundary more.
Yeah.
Interprets it than the Dalits. I collaborated with a colleague who works among the Himba in Namibia to do something very similar. We did a bunch of different versions where it was also like at marriage, but we contrasted two different cultural boundaries, because one of them was, we know that they're very culturally similar, and we know that they split up, the Himba and the Herero, like 100 years ago because of German genocidal campaign, basically. And so we know they're very culturally, linguistically similar, and they have more interaction. So we thought clearly that's a more porous boundary, right? And we contrasted it with the Damara, who are from a totally different like linguistic branch, and they're also lower status. And the Himba, who are pastoralists, see these, I guess they're also pastoralists now, but it's very low status, whereas the Herero are higher status. And so we expected to replicate that same kind of dynamic, both for the power differences and the cultural difference. And we found the exact opposite. I mean, these were all very low on essentializing, but in retrospect, again, very hindsight, post hoc accommodation, we're great at that, right? We interpret it as maybe that if you leave to go to this really horrible outgroup, or this outgroup that you really hate, you're burning your bridges. And so you're one of them now. Right? Whereas with the Herero, like they do have constant relations and they would love their daughter, like 100, I've never had like this kind of result. 100% of them said that they'd be happy for their daughters to marry a Herero and definitely not a Damara. And some of them offered to hang themselves if their children, married a Damara person. So it's like a really bad boundary to cross. And so if you're crossing it, you're no longer one of us. And I don't know if anybody's thought about that before with the switch to birth task, like, or found anything similar where it's actually picking up on bridge burning, basically.
Oh, that's so interesting. I think in a way that relates to my last point, and then I'll stop hogging the conversation, which is, it sounds like these were studies that were asking about the identity of a person. Would they be, this type of person or that type of person? And I think that may, in some cases, yield different results than if you ask about attributes. I was thinking about this in particular. Do you know Janet McIntosh's book from 20 years ago? I can't remember the name of it, but she looked at 2 ethnic groups, and I'm sorry, I don't remember where it was. It was one of the countries in Africa where the sort of religiously people were permitted to switch from one religious identity to another. And that was like considered like perfectly fine. And there were means of doing it and so forth. But then when she interviewed people, they would say things like, yeah, they can be a member of that group, but they wouldn't really be a member of that group. Or like their blood would still be the blood of the original group, but sure, they could go to that church if they wanted to. Bruce told me it's in Kenya, but I don't remember. I don't remember the names of the ethnic groups, but so it might be that the kind of decision you make to say whether someone could be a member of a social group has to do with the on the ground kind of realities of whether they would be accepted in this community kind of thing. But then whether you think they kind of share attributes with those people might be a different kind of judgment.
Yeah. So in the Himba Herero case, we did attributes as well, and we picked attributes that were explicitly like culturally different between them, like on the ground truth, and those made sense, right? Like those people understood how socialization worked. It made sense to my it's just obviously so ethnocentric, but like they made sense to my intuitions of how socialization worked, but they didn't really map onto identity. So it's in the appendix of that paper, I think, because I was like, nobody's going to publish this separately. But I do think that's interesting, like why, the cases where if identity doesn't map onto like anything else, we only did 3 attributes, but like if it doesn't map onto like other stuff in the world, then what's the point of like having that blood, right?
Yeah.
Because if the functional argument about essentialism is that it allows for these inductive inferences, then when you strip it, like what is...
Yeah, and I think, you would have to ask McIntosh about that with her study, but maybe like speculating here, maybe like someone is allowed to enter your group, but only so far in certain cases. Like maybe they're not fully accepted in certain ways, but.
Do people know this work? Sorry, just something that just made me think of, Susan. Do people know this work that Josh Knobe and others are authors on, what they call dual character concepts, where pointing this sort of lay distinction between sort of like the formal properties of being a group, or like, do you call them a member or not? But are they really a true member, right? So, and that there's some social categories that have this quality and others where it's really weird. Like it's really weird to be like, yeah, he's a bus driver, but if you think about what it really means to be a bus driver, you would have to say no. While like a scientist, you might have intuition. This person is not it doesn't have a job as a scientist, but they actually have all the properties that I think of. So they have the deep properties, but not necessarily the categorization. So this has a little bit of that quality, right? Like, oh, you hang out with us, you're kind of one of us, sure, but do you have the deep properties, the kind of core, kind of normative, deeply normative properties, maybe not, right? So that's kind of an interesting case where they come apart.
Yeah.
I should definitely look at those. Thank you. I know Florencia, sorry, did you have a question before and you dropped your hand? Or
Yeah, you can call me Flo. I initially wanted to ask more about what you've learned about any patterns in the studies where they ask about properties other than just identity, and whether they're like morphological or non-morphological cues that are essentialized. Just any patterns there. You mentioned a little bit about what it means to be they. So, for example, and speaking, by the way, speaking of like kind of a little bit scary stories you tell participants about the death of the parents. I was one of the students that helped the Menominee, Doug Medine, Sandy Waxman group collect data, and we had an RA that would say, and the cow died, and then flip the picture over, and the kindergarten kids would cry. So we had to kind of adjust, but I love telling that story about research methods and what to do with kids. But anyway, but there they made distinctions between physical and behavioral, obviously, but not all physicals are noticeable, right? Like outward appearance, like in this case, blood. So are there patterns there? And also I'm wondering what in that case, for example, but also generally, what using animals, what does it serve? Is it like, do people think of it in terms of, think of it analogically, or if they say that something is not inherited or it's not essentialized, is it because they reserve those judgments for humans? And so when you ask it using animals, they're just like, that's different, So what are the pros and cons, I guess, of using animal models in this case?
I have to admit that I didn't do the animal one in Peru because I thought it would be really hard to like ask adults that question. So like more kudos to you for like keeping a straight face while you ask adults about the duck, chicken, or cow.
Yeah, we mostly focused on with kids, I guess.
Oh, you did the kids one. Okay. So and kids are willing to go with you to crazy places, right? Which is fun. So at least for me, they serve as kind of some sort of baseline in terms of, I think it's evolutionarily, it's very plausible that humans and other species have something like a full biology, right? For thinking about biological kinds in the world. Species, maybe they're species, maybe they're genera, genus level. Have to ask Doug, and Scott, Atrin, and Medine about the status of that literature. But that seems very plausible to me. So phylogenetically, like I would think that's the original cognitive machinery that we have. And then I think that, maybe also sex. So I know that there have been these switched up birth stuff with sex, gender, and like some really interesting stuff with also like interesting samples of people who have siblings who are cis or not, or trans, or themselves are trans. And like, that doesn't seem to change things very much as far as I know. But I excluded this from this analysis because I also think that that's a different kind. Like, I think that humans and other species do have something like cognitive machinery for thinking about sex, and then for humans, maybe also gender. I'm uncomfortable with using gender for other species, although I know some biologists do. So for me, it's kind of a baseline. Like I believe that pattern of reasoning about the cow adopted by a goat, sorry, I don't know which is some sort of baseline that like reflects human intuitions about those kinds. And whatever we have for social groups has to be somehow maybe on top of that, different from that. I think it's really hard to parse those. Now, in terms of what the first question about like, what have we learned from the other traits that are not identity? Definitely more like, what's most reliable is that morphology versus belief difference, right? Morphological traits increase your stage. Now, there is also, I have to go back and check, like we definitely, and I know others like Susan, I'm sure others have looked at, internal versus external morphological traits. I was surprised in the Peruvian context how many people were willing to say that morphological traits were socialized, basically, were things that were environmentally influenced. And if you think about things like body shape, like that's not so surprising, right? But they also did say this pretty high rates of social influence for even things that were internal. The problem with this method is that like when you get up to 50%, like, is that just flipping a coin? That they're like a spleen, what's that? I like binary choices, forced choices, because people can answer them, right? And logistic regression, yay. But it is a little bit hard to tell whether they were just flipping a coin for some of these and then had stronger beliefs for like the more clear cut like belief traits. So both the Fijian and the Peruvian sample were, maybe they were more biologizing. I have to go back and look. But we're off in terms of the baseline, even though relative to like American participants, but they definitely showed that difference. And then there was this other category of like personality traits, and they were all over the place for personality traits. Like that's somehow in the middle. I think that's pretty common that it's in the middle. But I think people's intuitions about personality or like psychological traits, intelligence, like is all over the map. Yeah, we could do something like a principal component analysis of like which of these cohere with the identity, something like that. But we don't have that for so many different places, right? It's much more common to have the identity description.